He trusted his best friend with everything, his vision, his company, his future, until one quiet betrayal erased his name, his power, and rewrote his destiny forever. Marcus Ellington was not born into wealth, but he was born into pressure, the kind of pressure that either breaks a man quietly or forces him to rise louder than his circumstances ever intended. He grew up in a part of the city where ambition was often mistaken for arrogance, where dreaming too big could make you a target before it ever made you successful. But Marcus never learned how to think small. From a young age, he understood something most people around him did not, that survival was not the same thing as living, and he refused to spend his life just surviving. His mother worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, her hands always tired but her voice always steady, reminding him that discipline would take him places talent alone never could. His father was absent, not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet, consistent way that leaves questions unanswered and lessons self-taught. So Marcus built himself, piece by piece, lesson by lesson, failure by failure. He studied not just to pass, but to understand systems, people, and power, because even as a teenager, he knew that the world was not just about effort, it was about positioning. And positioning, he realized early, was everything. That mindset carried him into college, where he arrived not as the most privileged, but as one of the most focused. It was there that he met Darius Cole. Darius was different in ways that balanced Marcus perfectly. Where Marcus was calculated, Darius was charismatic. Where Marcus analyzed, Darius adapted. Where Marcus built strategies, Darius built relationships. Their connection was immediate, not because they were the same, but because they complemented each other in ways that felt almost intentional. Late nights turned into conversations about business, about ownership, about escaping the limits that had been quietly placed on them since childhood. They talked about building something real, not just a company, a legacy, something that would outlive them, something that would prove that they were more than what the world expected them to be. At first, it was just ideas scribbled in notebooks, drawn on whiteboards, debated over cheap meals and long nights. But ideas, when fueled by obsession and discipline, have a way of becoming real, and slowly those ideas started turning into plans. The plan turned into action, and action, no matter how small at first, started creating momentum. They launched their company with almost nothing. No major funding, no powerful connections, just belief, persistence, and a willingness to outwork everyone who doubted them. The early days were not glamorous. They were exhausting. They faced rejection after rejection, doors closing before they even had the chance to fully explain their vision. Investors dismissed them. Clients underestimated them. Competitors ignored them. But Marcus saw something others didn't. He saw the long game, and he played it with patience. Darius, on the other hand, played the present moment perfectly. He walked into rooms and made people listen. He turned skepticism into curiosity, and curiosity into opportunity. Together, they started winning. Small wins at first, then bigger ones, then the kind of wins that made people stop and take them seriously. Their company began to grow, not explosively at first, but steadily, consistently, in a way that built a strong foundation rather than a fragile illusion. Marcus handled the strategy, the operations, the structure that would keep everything running smoothly as they expanded. Darius handled the external world, the partnerships, the negotiations, the image that made their company attractive to those who mattered. It was a perfect balance. Or at least it seemed that way. As the company grew, so did their reputation. People started talking about them, not just as entrepreneurs, but as disruptors. 2 young black men building something powerful in spaces where they were rarely expected to succeed. Their story inspired others, but more importantly, it started attracting attention from people with influence. Investors who once ignored them now reached out. Opportunities that once felt out of reach now became accessible. The company expanded into new markets, secured major contracts, and began generating real wealth. Not just survival money, legacy money. Marcus felt proud not just of the success, but of the journey, because every step of it had been earned. Nothing was handed to them. Nothing was easy. And through it all, one thing remained constant: his trust in Darius. That trust was not casual. It was deep, rooted in years of shared struggle, shared vision, and shared sacrifice. Marcus believed in loyalty the way some people believe in faith, unconditionally. He never questioned Darius's intentions, never doubted his decisions, never imagined that the man, who stood beside him through every challenge, could ever stand against him. That kind of trust creates comfort, and comfort, while powerful, can also be dangerous, because it lowers your guard in places where you should be paying the most attention. As the company scaled, the structure became more complex, more paperwork, more legal processes, more decisions that required formal approval. Marcus focused on growth, innovation, and long-term strategy. He trusted Darius to manage the operational and executive responsibilities that required constant oversight, and Darius handled them flawlessly. Or at least that is what Marcus believed. Meetings became more frequent. Documents became thicker. Responsibilities became more divided. The company was no longer just an idea. It was a machine. And like any machine, it required precision to function properly. Marcus relied on systems. Darius relied on people. And somewhere in that balance, something subtle began to shift. Not obvious, not immediate, but present. Darius started spending more time with investors, building relationships that did not always include Marcus. At first, it seemed normal. After all, that was his role. That was what he was good at. But over time, those interactions became more private, more strategic, more controlled. Decisions were being influenced before they ever reached Marcus's desk. Narratives were being shaped in rooms Marcus was not present in. Perception was slowly changing, and perception in business is power. Marcus did not see it, not because he was careless, but because he was focused on building, on expanding, on ensuring that the company continued to grow without losing its foundation. He trusted that everything else was being handled with the same integrity he brought to the table. But trust, when unexamined, becomes vulnerability, and vulnerability in the wrong hands becomes opportunity. Darius began understanding something that Marcus refused to even consider. Control was not just about building something. It was about owning it completely, legally, structurally, irrevocably. And ownership, when combined with ambition, can either create greatness or justify betrayal. At first, it was small adjustments, minor changes in documents, subtle shifts in authority. Nothing drastic, nothing noticeable. Just enough to begin laying a foundation that only one of them fully understood. Marcus signed documents as they came, reviewing what mattered, trusting what seemed routine, because to him the partnership was solid, unbreakable. He never imagined that the same system they built together could be used against him. He never imagined that loyalty could be replaced by ambition so quietly. He never imagined that the man he trusted most was already thinking about power differently. But while Marcus was building a legacy, Darius had started building leverage. And leverage, once fully realized, changes everything. The company continued to grow. On the surface, everything looked perfect. Success, recognition, influence. They had become exactly what they once dreamed of becoming. But beneath that success, something else was growing. Something invisible. Something patient. Something dangerous. And Marcus had no idea that the foundation he trusted completely was already being rewritten beneath his feet. Because betrayal does not begin with an action. It begins with a decision, a quiet one, a selfish one, a final one. And once that decision is made, everything that follows becomes inevitable. The company had reached a level of success that once felt impossible. The kind of success that changes how people look at you, speak to you, and even how they pretend they always believed in you. Marcus Ellington walked through his office each morning with quiet confidence. Not arrogance, but the steady assurance of a man who had built something real from nothing. Glass walls reflected a life that had been earned, not inherited. Every deal, every contract, every expansion carried a piece of his effort, his discipline, his sacrifice. And at the center of it all stood the partnership that made it possible. At least, that was what Marcus still believed. Darius Cole had become more than a co-founder in the eyes of the world. He had become the face, the voice, the one investors called first, the one media outlets requested by name, the one who seemed to embody the company's rise with effortless confidence. Marcus did not mind. In fact, he encouraged it, because in his mind, success was shared, and recognition did not need to be evenly distributed to be meaningful. He trusted the foundation. He trusted the bond. And more importantly, he trusted Darius. But trust, when left unchecked, becomes assumption. And assumption in business is where control quietly slips away. The meeting started changing. At first, it was subtle. Darius would brief Marcus quickly before major discussions. summarizing key points, simplifying decisions, framing outcomes in a way that felt efficient. Marcus appreciated the efficiency. He was focused on expansion, on long-term growth, on building systems that would sustain the company beyond both of them. He did not realize that information was being filtered, not entirely hidden, just adjusted, controlled, presented in ways that shaped his perspective without him noticing. Board members began developing closer relationships with Darius. Private dinners, exclusive conversations, strategic alignments that happened outside official meetings. Again, nothing unusual on the surface. That was part of business. Relationships mattered. Influence mattered. But what Marcus did not see was how those relationships were being used to slowly reposition authority. Darius began speaking differently in those rooms. Carefully, confidently, strategically. He spoke about stability, about leadership continuity, about the importance of having a single, decisive voice guiding the company into its next phase. He never attacked Marcus directly. That would have been too obvious, too reckless. Instead, he reframed the narrative. Marcus became the visionary, the builder, the architect of what had already been created. And Darius positioned himself as the executor, the leader for what came next. It was subtle, but powerful. Because perception does not need to be loud to be effective. It just needs to be consistent. Meanwhile, the paperwork grew heavier. Legal documents, amendments, structural updates, approvals that required signatures, often quickly, often between meetings, often under the assumption that everything had already been reviewed. Marcus trusted the process. He trusted the system. He trusted Darius. And so he signed. Again, and again, and again. Each signature felt routine, necessary, part of growth. He never imagined that those same signatures were being used to build a case against him, not in reality, but on paper. And in business, paper often becomes reality. The day everything changed did not begin with chaos. It began like any other day. Marcus arrived early, coffee in hand, mind already moving through strategy, expansion plans, future projections. He was thinking about the next level, the next breakthrough, the next move that would solidify their place in an industry that had once ignored them. But as he walked through the office, something felt different. It was subtle, but undeniable. Conversation stopped a little too quickly. Eyes shifted away a little too fast. The usual energy felt restrained, controlled, like something had already happened and he was the last to know. His assistant approached him with hesitation, something Marcus had never seen before. There was a meeting, an urgent one, board members only. He wasn't informed ahead of time. That alone was unusual. Marcus nodded, calm but alert, and made his way to the conference room. Each step felt heavier than it should have, not because he knew what was coming, but because instinct was beginning to speak, and instinct, when it whispers, should never be ignored. He entered the room. The board was already seated. Darius sat among them, not beside Marcus's usual seat, but across from it. That was the first sign. Small, but significant. Marcus took his seat slowly, scanning the room, reading expressions, measuring silence. No one spoke immediately, and that silence said more than words ever could. Finally, one of the board members cleared his throat. His tone was professional, controlled, detached, and then the words came. A decision had been made. A leadership transition, effective immediately. Marcus Ellington was no longer the CEO. For a brief moment, time slowed. Not dramatically, not violently, just enough for reality to feel distant, unfamiliar. Marcus leaned back slightly, processing, not emotionally, but logically, because his mind always moved toward understanding before reaction. "This is a mistake," he said calmly. Not defensive, not aggressive, just certain. But the response he received was not correction. It was confirmation. Documents were placed in front of him. Thick, official, final. He looked down at them, scanning quickly, eyes sharp, mind accelerating. And then he saw it. His signature. Repeated. Authorized. Binding, but not real. Not given. Not his. The realization did not explode inside him. It settled. Heavy, cold, precise. He looked up slowly. His eyes moved across the room until they landed on Darius. And in that moment, everything became clear. Not just what had happened, but how long it had been happening. Darius met his gaze without hesitation. No guilt, no fear, No apology, just calm acceptance, as if this outcome had already been lived through in his mind long before this moment arrived. Marcus felt something shift inside him. Not anger. Not yet. Something deeper. Something quieter. Understanding, because betrayal like this does not happen suddenly. It is built, planned, executed over time. And Marcus realized that while he had been building the company, Darius had been building control, carefully, patiently, completely. The board spoke again, explaining the decision, referencing stability, growth, future direction. All the language of business, all the language of justification. But none of it mattered. Because Marcus already knew the truth. This was not about performance. This was not about leadership. This was about power. And power had been taken from him using the very system he trusted. He closed the folder slowly. His movements were calm, controlled, deliberate, because losing control in that moment would only give them what they expected. And Marcus had never been predictable. He stood up. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just with quiet finality. He looked at the board once more, then at Darius. And for the first time, there was a pause between them, a real one, not filled with words, but with truth. "You planned this," Marcus said. His voice was steady, low, certain. Darius did not respond immediately. And that silence was the answer. Marcus nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because at that point words were unnecessary. The truth had already spoken. He walked out of the room without another word, without anger, without resistance, but not without consequence. Because moments like that do not end when you leave the room. They begin. As Marcus stepped outside, the world felt different, not because it had changed, but because his understanding of it had. Everything he built was still there. The offices, the people, the success, but none of it belonged to him anymore, at least not legally, at least not on paper. But Marcus understood something in that moment that most people never do. Power taken through deception is never permanent. It only appears that way. And time has a way of correcting what manipulation tries to secure. He walked to his car slowly, each step measured, each thought sharpening. This was not the end. Not even close. It was a reset. A forced one. A painful one. But also a revealing one. Because now, Marcus saw everything clearly. The trust, the blind spots, the mistakes, the assumptions. All of it. And clarity, no matter how painful, is always powerful. But because he knew something they didn't, this story was not over. It had just changed direction. And when it came full circle, it would not be by chance. It would be by design. Losing everything in one moment does something to a man that no amount of success can ever prepare him for. Not the kind of loss that happens slowly, where you can adjust, adapt, and accept over time. But the kind that arrives all at once, clean and precise, leaving no room for denial and no space to negotiate. Marcus Ellington felt that loss deeply, but not in the way most people would expect. He did not break down in public. He did not lash out in anger. He did not chase validation or sympathy. Instead, he went quiet, not the silence of defeat, but the silence of recalibration. Because Marcus understood something that most people miss in moments of collapse. Emotion can cloud vision. And right now, more than anything, he needed to see clearly. The first few weeks were the hardest, not because of financial struggle, not because of uncertainty, but because of the shift in identity. One day, he was the founder, the leader, the architect of something powerful. The next, he was nothing. At least that is how the world treated him. Calls stopped coming. Emails slowed down. People who once insisted on being close suddenly found reasons to be distant, not out of cruelty, but out of convenience. Because proximity to power is often mistaken for loyalty, and when the power shifts, so does the proximity. Marcus noticed it all. Every silence, every absence, every subtle change in behavior. And instead of resenting it, he studied it. Because in those patterns, he saw truth. Not just about others, but about himself. About where he had been strong and where he had been blind. He replayed everything, every decision, every document, every moment he chose trust over verification. And slowly, the pain began to transform into something else. Understanding, not the kind that comforts you, but the kind that sharpens you. He realized that the betrayal was not just about Darius. It was also about systems, about control, about structure. He had built a powerful company, but he had not protected his position within it with the same intensity. He had assumed loyalty where he should have enforced clarity. He had trusted character where he should have secured contracts. And that mistake cost him everything. But it also gave him something invaluable: awareness. And awareness, when combined with discipline, becomes power. Marcus did not rush back into the world. He did not try to rebuild immediately. He waited, observed, learned. He studied legal frameworks, corporate structures, governance systems, not casually, obsessively. He wanted to understand every mechanism that had been used against him, not so he could repeat it, but so he could never be vulnerable to it again. Meanwhile, Darius thrived. From the outside, everything looked perfect. The company continued to grow. Revenue increased. Recognition expanded. Darius was celebrated as a visionary leader, a symbol of success, a man who had taken a company to the next level. Media outlets praised him. Industry leaders respected him. His name carried weight. But success built on unstable foundations carries a different kind of energy, one that looks strong, but feels fragile. Because deep down, control gained through deception always requires maintenance. Constant, careful, exhausting maintenance. Darius began making decisions alone, not out of necessity, but out of habit. Because when you take power without earning full trust, you start believing that control must be absolute to be safe. And absolute control slowly isolates you. At first, the changes were small: a shift in company culture, a difference in how decisions were communicated, a growing distance between leadership and team members. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming, but noticeable. Over time, those small shifts began to compound. Employees who once felt connected to the mission began to feel replaceable. Executives who once collaborated began to compete. Trust, once strong, started to weaken. And where trust weakens, instability begins. Marcus watched all of this from a distance. Not obsessively, not emotionally, but strategically, because he understood that time reveals what actions try to hide. And he was patient, not passive. Patient, there is a difference. Passive waiting is hope without action, but patient waiting is preparation with intention. Marcus was preparing, quietly, relentlessly. He started building again, but this time everything was different. No shortcuts, no assumptions. No blind trust. Every structure was intentional. Every agreement was clear. Every role was defined. He surrounded himself with people who understood accountability, not just loyalty. People who questioned, challenged, and verified. Because real strength does not come from agreement. It comes from clarity. The new company did not grow loudly. There were no headlines, no public celebrations, no sudden recognition. It grew quietly, strategically. The kind of growth that does not attract attention until it becomes impossible to ignore. Marcus focused on value, real value, not perception, not image, but substance. And slowly, that value began to attract the right kind of attention. Clients who cared about results, partners who respected structure, investors who understood long-term vision. The foundation was stronger, smarter, unshakable. Years passed. And while Marcus built in silence, Darius built in visibility. But visibility has a cost, because the higher you stand, the more pressure you carry. And pressure reveals cracks. At first, it was internal disagreements, then strategic missteps, then decisions that felt more reactive than intentional. The company was still successful, but the stability Marcus had built into it was no longer there. Because stability is not something you inherit. It is something you maintain. And Darius was beginning to struggle with that maintenance. He trusted less, controlled more, delegated carefully, questioned constantly, because somewhere deep inside, he knew the truth. He had taken power, but he had not secured peace. And without peace, leadership becomes a burden. Marcus, on the other hand, moved differently, calm, focused, certain, because he no longer built from ambition alone. He built from understanding, from experience, from lessons that had been paid for at the highest cost. And then slowly something began to shift. Not loudly, not suddenly, but undeniably. The same industry that once celebrated Darius began to question, quietly at first, then more openly. Concerns about leadership decisions, whispers about internal instability, doubts about long-term direction. Nothing confirmed, but enough to create tension. And tension, when left unresolved, grows. At the same time, Marcus's new company began to gain recognition, not because he chased it, but because results demanded it. Partnerships expanded, Opportunities increased, and his name, once forgotten, started to reappear. But this time, it carried something different. Respect built on resilience, not just success, because people admire achievement, but they respect recovery. The industry began to notice the contrast. One leader rising quietly with stability, another struggling visibly with control. And though no one said it directly, the shift was happening. Slowly, naturally, inevitably. Marcus did not rush it. He did not force it. Because he understood something most people don't. Karma does not need assistance. It only needs time. And time, when combined with truth, always corrects the balance. Marcus continued building. Focused, unshaken. Prepared, because he knew, without needing confirmation, that the story was not finished. Not yet. The roles had changed. The power had shifted. But the outcome was still unfolding. And when it reached its final moment, it would not be driven by revenge. It would be driven by consequence. Because every action leaves a mark. Every decision creates a ripple. And eventually those ripples return, not as punishment, but as balance. And that balance was getting closer, closer than anyone realized. Power does not disappear suddenly. It erodes, quietly, gradually, almost invisibly at first. And by the time most people notice, it is already too late to hold on to it. Darius Cole did not wake up one morning and lose everything. That would have been easier, cleaner, predictable. Instead, he experienced something far more unsettling, a slow unraveling, the kind that forces you to watch your own empire weaken piece by piece, while still pretending to the world that everything is under control. At first, it was pressure, not unusual pressure, just more of it, more expectations, more scrutiny. More questions from people who once accepted his decisions without hesitation. Board meetings became longer, more intense, less agreeable. Where there had once been confidence, there was now caution. Where there had once been trust, there was now verification. Darius noticed it immediately. Of course he did. Because when you take control through manipulation, you become highly sensitive to any shift in perception. He adjusted quickly. Tighter control, stronger language, more decisive actions. But control does not rebuild trust. It only hides the absence of it. And over time, that absence became impossible to ignore. Key executives began leaving. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily. One by one, each departure came with polite explanations, professional reasons, carefully worded statements. But the pattern was clear. Something inside the company was no longer stable, and those who understood systems could feel it. Investors began asking deeper questions, not just about growth, but about structure, governance, accountability. Documents were reviewed more closely, decisions were analyzed more critically, and somewhere within those reviews, small inconsistencies began to surface. At first, they seemed insignificant. Minor discrepancies, technical irregularities, the kind of details that could easily be explained away. But patterns do not hide forever. And once a pattern begins to reveal itself, it becomes impossible to ignore. Legal teams got involved, quietly at first. Internal reviews, compliance checks, nothing public, nothing alarming, but enough to create tension beneath the surface. Darius felt it. Of course he did. Because he knew where those inconsistencies came from. He knew what had been done, how it had been done, and more importantly, why it had been done. But knowing the truth does not give you control over it, especially when that truth begins to move beyond your reach. The investigations expanded. Documents were re-examined. Signatures were verified. Timelines were reconstructed. And slowly, the foundation of the company's leadership transition began to crack. Not publicly, not yet, but internally, the certainty was gone. Questions turned into concerns. Concerns turned into conclusions. And those conclusions could no longer be contained. The truth surfaced the way it always does. Not all at once, but in undeniable pieces, forged authorizations, manipulated approvals, irregular transfers of executive authority. Everything Marcus had understood in that moment years ago was now being confirmed through process, through evidence, through undeniable fact. The board was forced to act, not out of loyalty, not out of morality, but out of necessity. Because once the integrity of leadership is compromised, everything built under it becomes unstable. Darius was called into a meeting. The same room, the same table, the same structure of power that had once worked in his favor. But this time, the energy was different. He was not in control of the narrative. He was not shaping perception. He was facing consequence. The documents were presented, the findings explained, the conclusions made clear. There was no room for interpretation, no space for manipulation, no opportunity to redirect. For the first time in years, Darius sat in silence. Not calculated silence, not strategic silence, but real silence. The kind that comes when reality finally catches up. He tried to speak, to explain, to justify. But justification requires belief, and no one in that room believed him anymore. Because trust, once broken, does not return when convenient. It disappears. Completely, decisively. And in that moment, the same system he had used to take power removed it from him. Cleanly, officially, irrevocably. Darius Cole was no longer the CEO. But this time there was no confusion, no misunderstanding, no hidden truth waiting to be revealed. This was final, and this was deserved. News spread quickly. Because truth, once exposed, moves faster than any narrative that tried to contain it. The industry reacted, not with shock, but with recognition. Because deep down, many had sensed something before they could prove it, and now proof existed. Reputation shifted, respect disappeared, and the image that had once been carefully constructed collapsed under the weight of reality. Marcus Ellington watched all of this without celebration, without satisfaction, without revenge, because he had already moved beyond that. His focus was not on Darius anymore. It had not been for a long time. His focus was on what he had built, on what he had become, on what could never be taken from him again. But something unexpected happened. The same board that had once removed him reached out, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. Because leadership is not just about position, it is about capability. And Marcus had proven, not through words but through time, that he possessed something far more valuable than control. Integrity, vision, stability. They requested a meeting, not as a formality, but as an opportunity. Marcus considered it carefully. Because returning to the past is not always progress. Sometimes it is regression. But this was different. This was not about reclaiming what had been taken. This was about redefining what ownership truly meant. He walked into that same building again, years later, not as the man who had been removed, but as the man who had rebuilt. Stronger, sharper, unshakable. The room felt familiar, but he was not the same. And that changed everything. They offered him a position, not just as CEO, but as controlling authority, with full structural protection, with legal clarity, with safeguards that ensured what happened before could never happen again. Marcus listened, calm, measured, thoughtful. Because power offered is different from power taken. One requires acceptance, the other requires recovery. He did not answer immediately. Because decisions like that are not made in moments. They are made in understanding. And Marcus understood everything now. He understood the system, the risks, the responsibilities, and most importantly himself. After a long pause, he spoke, not with emotion, but with certainty. "I will not rebuild what was broken," he said. "I will redefine it." And that was the difference. He did not return as the same man. He returned as something more. A leader shaped not just by success, but by loss. Not just by ambition, but by awareness. The transition was executed carefully, legally, transparently, and for the first time, everything was aligned, not just on paper, but in truth. Marcus Ellington stood once again at the top. But this time it was different, because nothing about his position depended on assumption. Everything was secured. Everything was earned. Everything was real. And that made it untouchable. Darius faded from the spotlight. Not erased, but remembered differently. As a lesson, as a warning, as proof that shortcuts to power always come with consequences. Marcus did not speak publicly about what happened. He did not tell his side. He did not defend his past, because he understood something most people spend their lives chasing. Truth does not need promotion. It reveals itself. And when it does, it speaks louder than anything you could ever say. The company grew again, stronger than before, more stable than ever. Not because it had been rebuilt, but because it had been redefined. And Marcus, the man who had once lost everything, had gained something far greater than power. Clarity, because some men build success, but very few survive losing it and return stronger. And in that return, they do not just reclaim what was theirs. They become something that can never be taken again. Because in the end, betrayal may steal your position for a moment, but time, truth, and discipline will always restore what was built with purpose and elevate it beyond reach forever.